Thank you, Aaron, and Felicity for leading, and worship team for selecting those songs, wonderful songs. I don't know what Aaron saw in me that I was worried about what to speak. Maybe she knows me, but she nailed it. I was actually kind of hoping that the Holy Spirit would just take her and just preach. So I guess I'll have to do that. Last week I invited you to engage in dialogue with me that I had 2 Sundays to preach the rest, the topic of rest, and that maybe we could engage in between, and then I would learn from you guys and be able to shape my second piece in a way that we get a little more understanding. And so I thank you for your prayer, Aaron, that we would get a little more about what rest means. So I'm glad you said that, because we're not going to get everything. And so anyway, at the end of last Sunday, I wasn't down the steps, and I got 3 people that came up to me right away and chastised me for missing some key points. It wasn't chastisement, it was immediate engagement. And so there was 3 up front. It was Erin first, and she goes, and so I don't know if SBC's doing something right over there, and I'm like, she should be preaching this. What Erin said to me, she goes, I always thought, or I've learned, or I don't know how you phrased it, that rest is the how did you word it? It's the healing or the union of 3 relationships. You have God, people, and land. And you can think of it as a triangle. And so I don't know if Gord Penner's been teaching Daniel Block, because I knew that, and I didn't say it, and she was right. Whenever the Bible talks about rest, it's a healed household. And it's a cosmic household. And it's the union of heaven, of people, and land. So it's the union of heaven and earth. And I don't know if I said that clearly. And so I was thinking, maybe it's not just SBC's doing something right, because Dimitri's been engaging with me about, well, how does work relate to rest? How does rest give meaning to work? And Dimitri has some interesting questions. And then Christina, she said something about, if you read the poem of Genesis 1, they think about days differently than we do. They begin with evening. They begin with evening. Your day begins with evening, and so every day begins with you sleeping, resting, and it's telling you something. We think of our day as when the sun rises, right? Or whenever we have to go to work. I don't know how Alexis thinks about days, because she works some weird hours. I don't know how your days work out there, but so that was pretty interesting. And so the whole Sabbath, or the whole creation poem is all about the Sabbath, and that God desires Sabbath. So what is this Sabbath? And I think I've been thinking about it. Andrea and I have been talking for some time. Who else sent me some stuff? Ivan. And so I can see that there's quite a few people here that could talk about rest and give a different angle to it. And so rest is the way the Bible talks about the salvation of all things. That's the word. It was in the passage that Aaron read, that the Father has given all things under him. And what are these all things? And it's pretty routine that the Bible talks about all things. And it's just not my personal salvation, my escape off the earth to some other realm. It's the harmony and the union of all things good. And so I want to continue on that topic this morning. And so all things can be summarized in that triangular relationship that Aaron pointed out between God, humanity, and creation or land. Rest is the union of heaven and earth. And if you look at the location of the 4th commandment, the commandment to keep the Sabbath, it connects the commandments on how we relate to God with how we relate to people and the land. And so the Sabbath is a bridging command that protects both relationships. And ultimately, the Sabbath is to protect your identity, who you are. Because if you don't know who you are, you will wreck these relationships. You will be the cause of unrest. And so the whole thing is about teaching us how harmony will come about and the things we need to do. And so rest is then a way to describe a healed household. The book of Hebrews, if you've ever read the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it picks up on the theme of this healed household. The first 3 chapters, I think, talk all about oikos. It's more than just a yogurt. I think oikos is a yogurt, right? It's a Greek yogurt. It means household. Ah. How do you eat a household? Anyway, it's supposed to give you a taste of home, Ernie. I think that's what it means, home, right? Oikos. And so next time you eat yogurt, I want you guys to think about rest. This is good. So you don't have to worry about what I'm saying today. You just eat yogurt. Make sure you pick oikos. It's the holy yogurt. And so it moves from oikos, oikonomia, household economy, and it talks about rest through the rest of the book of Hebrews. And there's this relationship between healing and rest and God building this cosmic house. And so, very interesting. So I did promise to get to Matthew 11 today and teach New Testament stuff. But I can't promise I'll stay there because it connects back to the Old Testament. Joe, so I'm sorry. I shouldn't be, right? Anyway, thank you, Aaron, for reading that. That first section, Matthew 11:26. So let's get into it, or 25. At that time, Jesus declared, in other words, he's praying. He's actually praying. I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. And he talks about having all things handed over to me by my Father. And then he goes into this sort of relationship talk between him and the Father. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. This whole section opens up with I would say, a theology of the incarnation. I don't know how much you guys think about the incarnation. It's no little trivial theology. There's certain traditions in church that have really stayed close to the incarnation as the theology from which all other theologies build. If you don't get the incarnation, you will get a lot of things wrong. Where's Andrea? I think the Orthodox Church really has the incarnation. Cornelius is a big Orthodox guy. I know we have a couple of Eastern Orthodox people in our church. I don't know what we do about that. The incarnation. What do you guys know about the incarnation? Who is Jesus? That's the question. That is always the question that the biblical writers are trying to answer. I've been phrasing salvation as making all things new. And sometimes I think I've been saying the restoration of all things or the healing of all things or something like that. And when you think about the incarnation, the better way to describe salvation is the perfecting of all things. Because the phrase making all things new or restoring kind of leads you to think that he's making things back the way they were. And if you go all the way back the way the things were in the garden. And so God's working on bringing us back to the garden. And in a sense he is, but really he's perfecting things. He's working forward toward a city. And I talked a little bit about last week. The perfecting of all things, meaning God in harmony with land and creation and people. To perfect that, and when you have that perfected, you have a healed and a whole city. That's Revelation. And so, what is this perfecting of all things? Jesus, or the incarnation, I should say, is the embodiment of perfection of the heaven and earth. And so we have the Son of God in perfect union with Jesus of Nazareth, of a historical figure. So we have heaven and earth coming together in perfection. So the incarnation becomes the first perfect union of heaven and earth. And then the rest of salvation talks about how the incarnation teaches us what salvation of all things is. Right? And so that's he talks about this. And this isn't the only place. There's much more in-depth conversations. And when you listen to the writers, they are trying to answer questions 50 years on, 30 years on. Who is this Jesus? How can he be perfectly God and perfectly human at the same time? There's no way to explain it. You can have a series of doctrines, a tribe, but you're always just getting a piece of it, that he's fully God and fully human. Neither one of them get compromised. That's perfection. And that is what he is doing with the cosmos. And so there's a bit of a mystery there. And so you're always talking about the incarnation in the first couple hundred years of church history, and even in Paul and in Jesus' day. That's a whole theology that I can't get into. But when you start understanding that he is perfectly God and perfectly human, you're talking about what it means to be saved, what it means that God's plan is for the universe. And I can only leave you to think about that. And so what that then means, and it's accurate, is that the garden is never described as perfect. It's always described as good and very good. In other words, you begin with something very good, but it is not perfected, meaning it is not complete. And so man gets brought into it to help God bring it into perfection. And so all the culture making stuff that we do, the filling and the tilling of the earth, is God's plan. His plan to perfect creation. And when you think about your identity and your purpose and history, I've always been struggling with history. What's the point of history? Why this long, drawn-out thing from Moses to Jesus dying on the cross for us? It's always a disconnect unless you understand that there's a point. There's a logical point, and there's a purpose that God has in allowing history to develop. And so all these good things we make, and all these good things that we create, that there's something good in there, but I'm not supposed to love it too much. Well, it depends. And you never quite know what all fits. And you get to the end of the book of Revelation, and you have the glory of man, you have the glory of God, and the glory of the nations, the glory of man, filling Jerusalem. And then it descends to earth. That's the story. And so the glory of God and the glory of man. So that's Jesus, the incarnation. And so you have the glory of God and the glory of the nations. Nations multicultural. All the good things that the different, and I've talked about this, the Italians bring pizza, and Mexicans with their tacos and stuff. And when that gets brought together in perfect union, you have salvation, and the new Jerusalem comes and finds its foundation on earth forever and ever and ever. That's the incarnation, okay? The idea of the fullness of heaven uniting with the fullness of humanity is found perfectly in the union of the Son of God with the historical person of Jesus. We need to get that. We need to maybe come back to that more. And that is described as rest. And so what does it mean to enter Jesus' rest? We can start thinking about this sort of thing. And so when we get to the Gospels and a lot of Paul's letters, that's the grand story. And all the little stories that don't totally make sense and they seem to be disconnected or disjoined, we won't get them. And they'll be contradictory even if we don't get the grand story of salvation. And it's the perfecting of all things. And so the gospel writers in particular, and Matthew here, is concerned about showing their readers, their audience, their church audience. You think about who Matthew's audience was. Jesus had already ascended. Decades in, decades out, they're wondering, when is this return of the Christ? When is the return of Jesus happening? Right? You would think. We get impatient after a week. When's that showing up? These guys have been decades now, and Jesus has promised to return, but he's not. And so Matthew and all the gospel writers have to reinforce to their church audience that, no, he's returning, and this is the plan. Right? And who is this Jesus? So you have questions about who is Jesus. And so one of the ways that they always do it is by showing the signs. Look at the signs that Jesus did. He is the guy. He is the Messiah. He is the one. And so anytime you see or read something of a sign, you have some sort of picture of the inbreaking of heaven on earth. And so when it says we are a sign, the people of God are a sign, meaning the way we live, the way we organize our lives, the way we treat one another, heaven is in some way breaking into earth in the physical realm. Very important what we do here. And so that's that. That whole section begins with a comment or a little phrase that doesn't seem like much. He says, at that time. Time. At that time, it's important because it's related to creation and redemption. That word time here, when we think of time, the Westerners, the way we think of time is chronology. The way we measure minutes and hours and days, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's how we order our lives. And the word for that is, the Greek word is chronos. Is that how you pronounce that? You taking Greek yet? Andrea, chronos? Or is it chronos? Chronos, from where we get chronology. The word here is not chronos, it's kairos. I'm probably butchering it. I don't know Greek. The word he uses here is at that kairos. He doesn't say, he's not giving you chronology. He's saying something about the time. It's the season. It's very interesting. When we're preoccupied with chronos, in the way we think of time, we always think about it in terms of that quantity, minutes, seconds. And the minute you start worrying about it quantitatively, we get anxious. We think about it. Don't waste time. Time waits for no one. Time is of the essence. Time is money. Right? That's how we think of time. We're anxious, and we begin anxious. We're trying to control time. Abe Clausen talks a lot about time almost every time we have a discussion. You grasp that time is the one thing we've been given. And everything else kind of falls under that, whether it's money or anything else. Don't screw up time. Anytime we're thinking about time, we're thinking about it as a demanding thing, as a consuming thing, even a restrictive thing. Chronos. It's negative. Chronos time will lead to chaos if we do not keep track of it. Right? Try just deciding when to show up. What happens if you show up 12 seconds late to a 100-meter dash at the Olympics? You missed the whole thing, right? And so you think time's important. Showing up on time is important. If you decide you want to come to church whenever you feel like, people will come in, you'll have chaos, right? And so we're trying to control time. So it's important to organize your chronos. Good time management is the effort to synchronize your personal time with the other people's time that you associate with. That's what time management is, so that you can be in sync. Don't be late for dinner regularly. You're not going to make it. There is a need for positive chronos time management. And then the negative chronos time management is the attempt to micro-control it. Then it becomes negative. It'll become anxious. You'll become consumed by it. You'll try to control or manipulate it, and you'll attempt to try to make time. You can't make chronos time, but you can make time, and that's the word here. What do we mean when we talk about making time with our kids? When we make time for someone in our life, what are we doing? We can't make more minutes in a day. What you're talking about is setting a certain time for something important. That's kairos. At that time, there's something important. And so kairos time is qualitative. It's a quality of something. And it's not measured in units. And it's measured according to the quality of experience. This is important. Stay with me here. Apparently, the concept of kairos has its origins in the practice of archery, of Greek archery. And kairos represents, and hunters might know this, represents the moment when the archer finds the perfect opening to shoot his arrow to hit the target. Hey, Eddie, who's all hunters here? Right? Or do you hunt with a bow or one of these with a trigger thing? Or anyway, I'm not a hunter. Right? There's always this perfect opening and a perfect opportunity. And it's a special moment. There's something of quality to it. And so Jesus coming here is telling us something about an appointed time. That's what it means literally, the appointed time. This has its roots in the creation story. This is important. Remember I said that Genesis is a creation poem. I've been sticking with that. It's not a scientific information booklet. And us Christians have been sucked into a modernist approach, a scientific approach to the text. We've been sucked into it over the last 50, 75 years. It's not a science book. And we argue Genesis 1 scientifically. It's 7 days literal. It's this. It's not. It's how old is the earth? And we get sucked into questions that Moses' audience was not asking. They didn't need to know how long it took for God to create creation. There's something very important that Israel had to learn. And it's probably the very important thing that we need to learn. And so what is this thing that we need to learn? And so this is from Ivan's thing that he sent me. In Eastern way of learning, truth is discovered. It's something you discover. In Westerns, it's passing of information. Right? Andrea, when you teach, you just got to pass information down to your little kids. And you give them details. Well, maybe not. Maybe at your age, the kids still get to discover. Lanita, do kids discover truths in your house? Or do you tell them what to do? This is who you are. That's good. In this poem, I'm not going to get into what style of poem it is. At each end, you have nothingness. You have, in the beginning, there was chaotic waters. At the end, at the end of the poem, you have God doing nothing. He's at rest. It's at complete. So there's chaos in the rest, but nothingness is sort of the bookends or the ends of each poem. And at the very center, and this guy's done the count, in the Hebrew is a word. And so this whole poem is cradling this one thing that Israel needs to know about themselves and about creation. And the word is in the very middle of the poem, and it's the word moed. It's in Genesis 1:14. It's on the fourth day. And God said, "Let there be light in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons," moed, "and for days and years." Here the word moed is translated as season, appointed time. The sun and the moon are for signs and seasons, for days and years. So what? What's this got to do with rest? What's this got to do with rest? The first thing that Israel was to know about creation, even before Genesis 3, we get stuck on Genesis 3 where the sin. We start with sin. We're sinful. That's the second thing you learn. The first thing you learn is that creation is good. It is good. And when humans are in their right place in relation to creation and God, it is very good. It is very good. And so moed shows up 233 times in the Old Testament. 13 times it refers to season, as it does here. 150 times it refers to the meeting place with God. It's the tent of meetings. It's in Numbers and some of the earlier books. It's the tent of meeting. It's the place where you meet God. Okay? That's 150 times. 23 times it's translated as a feast. It's the same word. It's party time. It's appointed. That's what it is, a celebration. What was that song that call to worship, Ernie? To celebrate God's abundance, right? I think that was the call. Psalm. David knew it. David knew what Sabbath rest was for. It's a meeting place with God, and you celebrate, and you're either communing with God in quiet time, or you're celebrating with God and other people in a time that's a little louder. We did a little bit of that last night. Is Jim here? Jim and Fred? Man, those guys were crying yesterday. I was feeling a little sensitive this morning, Pete. I'm like, it's contagious. I've never seen Fred cry so much. Jim, I was expecting it. He's a big teddy bear. So 150 times it refers to an appointed meeting time with God. It's appointed. And 23 times an appointed feast, an appointed party time with God and with his people, celebrating his good abundance. What is the commonality in all these various ways of interpreting moed? Moed is another way to refer to Sabbath rest. It's all about Sabbath rest. It's all about Sabbath rest. When you think about who Genesis 1 was written to, the very first audience, the very first time Moses it's the redeemed people. It's the ex-slave. It's the freed slaves. They had been in Egypt for 430 years. They have been told who they are and what they're for 400 generation after generation. You're slaves. That's your identity. You make bricks for Pharaoh. And so how do you find your worth in Pharaoh's economy? By how many bricks you can make. Your worth is tied to the amount of bricks you can make. And the more bricks you make, the more you're worth. Right? That's your identity. I think our culture is caught up in Pharaoh's economic model in various ways. So Israelite, that's what they know. And there's pretty good evidence that they had very few days off. They had very few. There was no moed time. There was no appointed time, regular appointed time to spend with God. So one of the first things that you lose when you're in slavery is the ability to commune with God, to worship God. And the other one is, and related to it, is to celebrate. Now, they must have had some form of it. We'll get to that a little bit later. So Israel just coming out of Egypt, what's the very first thing that they need to know as slaves? They need to unlearn and undo the things about who they've been told they are. You're not slaves. You're image bearers of God. You're loved. Your value has nothing to do with the amount of bricks that you can make. That's a hard lesson to unlearn, and it's a hard lesson to learn. And so Moses gives them an entirely new definition of human value and creation, and the value of creation. Creation is good, and it is very good when you're not in slavery, when you're in relation to God as his image bearer, creating culture that corresponds with God's creation making. Your culture making is somehow fits, and you're perfecting all things. So the purpose of rest here is to enter into kairos, time with God. I've really dwelled on this is because we're always wondering, what does it mean Jesus is the fulfillment of rest, and how do we enter into that rest? We enter into Jesus and everything he stands for, and the one thing I've been emphasizing what he stands for is that he is perfectly human and perfectly God. He is the perfection of heaven and earth. And so when we enter into it, somehow the work we do has to correspond with that. And so he gives us what that looks like by his life, by his teachings. And so one of the things we need to do is learn how to let go of our own slavery. That's a hard thing to do. You can think about the many ways in which we are forced to do the things that we don't want to do. Even in my own business, I shared a little bit about that last Sunday. There are things that I have to do that I don't want to do, but it's the economy we live in. And so you have to remember now, Matthew's audience was still in exile. They're living in Rome, under Rome's rule. Rome is a new Egypt. Rome's given them a little bit of freedom. You can practice your religion, just do not disrupt civil life, because then you'll get booted out, you'll get crucified, if you lead a rebellion against us, you'll get crucified. And so they always give them a little bit of freedom. And so what happens when you're always given a little bit of freedom, but you're not quite free? You're sort of in this liminal stage, right? And so this whole passage, I didn't get Aaron to read it, maybe I should have, but just 2 sections above that, and you guys can go there, in chapter 11, Jesus has been going through the cities, and the Jewish cities, they're his people. Bethsaida, Chorazin, I think, and then Capernaum, his hometown. It's sort of like 3 little cities, they're towns, I don't know if they call them cities, in his little area. He's been doing most of his miracles in that little triangle, starting at the very center, like trying to teach them who they are and how to live in exile, how to experience rest in exile. And they reject him. Remember the question I asked, what happens when you're sort of in this between, where you have just enough freedom to make decisions for yourself? You take on a new form of identity that's a halfway identity. And so you can practice your religion, but you're completely bought into the economy and the identity of a Roman citizen. And you find your worth, and you get wealthier, and you have opportunity. And so Rome leaves you alone. In fact, they probably applaud you and give you awards and give you promotions. And before you know it, as a Jew living in exile, you become functionally a Roman citizen. And your identity is now kind of tied up in the values of the Roman Empire. And the hierarchy is very strict in Rome, like how you value humanity. It's a whole different topic. Rest here, who is the invitation to? They get Jesus gets rejected because they are unrepentant. They're unrepentant. And so Jesus equates them to Sodom. Jesus equates his hometown, he used it in the same sentence. This is important to get. What was Sodom known for? The easy one is a sexual perversion, homosexuality, but that's not really what he's referring to here. He's referring to Sodom as the portrait of inhospitality. There's exclusion. These are God's people. They're excluding. They're not hospitable. They're self-serving. They're stepping on one another to get to the top, to appease the Roman Empire. They have a certain way of life, the Jewish people. They have secured a very good life. Jesus, the way he teaches, wants them to give it up. And he's doing miracles. There is a better way to live. And constantly competing and comparing yourself. That's what opportunity does. That's what this halfway thing does. In Egypt, there is no opportunity. You're a slave. You can make more bricks. We'll throw you a couple more cucumbers. That's it. In this halfway place, you get to have certain value as assigned to you by the place that you live. That becomes your value. That becomes your value. They reject Jesus. Who is this invitation of rest extended to? I would say people in a position of affluence. Usually we think of this as those at the bottom, the poor. Of course, it's given to everyone, the whole city, with all its multicultural, its full spectrum of social hierarchies, the poor, the rich, whatever. And I would even suggest that it's given to those near the top who are in a place of influence and have money. What's he asking them to give up? Some of their control, some of their power, some of their money. That's why they reject him. It's very practical. We reject him for the same reason. It's the unrepentant are those who do not want to let go of control. And so the invitation is given to those who are well-to-do, who are self-sufficient. Those who are living their best life. Those that find their worth in being an upstanding, contributing citizen of Bethsaida, which is citizenship in Rome. Those that forget that they are enslaved because things have been following the same endless pattern of no rest for so long, they don't even know what rest is. They don't even know what rest is. Eric sent me a comment, I don't know if he's here, that we sure got things backwards. He did an essay on Hebrews, the rest in Hebrews, and so I'm sure he'll share that with you. We don't know who we are. And we know that that's a question because the levels of anxiety among wealthy people, the addictions among wealthy people. We don't know who we are. We don't even know what human nature is. And there's plenty of people willing to tell us what human nature is, and it's always a lower definition. It's always some definition where you have to compete for that, and you have to compare for that. And so this thing about, I will never look back, what song was that, Ernie? I will never look back, I will never, it's basically talking about the new life, the new creation. I will never look back to my old life. That's easier. More like Jesus. More like, thank you. Alexis knows her songs. More like Jesus, I will never look back, but we do. Numbers 11, I'm going to get back to the Old Testament a little bit. Numbers 11 is a really good, I would say, picture of our struggle to take on the new creation, the new man that Jesus promises us to become more like Jesus. Numbers 11, Numbers is a cool book, guys. You guys, I know you guys don't think about them, but no, I read Numbers. The coolest stories are Numbers. Go ahead and read them. It's where Moses strikes the rock, water comes out, and he disobeys God, and for that reason, he doesn't get to go to Promised Land. Tough stuff for a leader. Don't screw up. Anyway, Numbers 11, verse 4. Now the rabble, I like that word. We all have rabble among us. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. The word here is covet. Had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again, whining again, and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." They're in the desert. They're delivered out of slavery. They're heading toward the promised land, but they're not there. They're in this in between. Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt. That cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Imagine laying out in the desert. Eddie, that's what I'd be dreaming of. I'd be looking back. God has promised them something, but they're not there yet. How quickly we look back. These are our Yeshvista. These are our relatives. And now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. So when I had COVID, I lost my taste. I couldn't taste, and I'm a foodie. My strength was dried up. And the strength is desire, the desire for goodness. That's what it means here, right? I want to taste coffee. I want to taste steak and all the delicious yummies of the. Anyway, I was in the desert, and I was thinking of the good old days. My strength was dried up. We have a group within us redeemed people that are stirring things up. Hey, remember back in Egypt, we got to have fish and leek and all these good things. That cost us nothing. That phrase has stuck with me. What did it cost them? Freedom. That's us. We are willing to sell our souls so that we can gain the world. That's this. What is the problem here? The problem is the way we've given up on the high ideal of human experience and of what humans' life could be like together on earth with God and with each other. We've given up on that ideal, and we've set the standard lower. We've set the bar lower to some kind of middle slavery. And we chase, and we pursue, and we compete, and we compare, and we go, and we go, and we go, and we go, and we think that is the highest standard we're ever going to get. And God's promise is somehow so far removed from reality. And part of the reason why it's removed from reality is because we do not take moed. We do not make appointed time and commune with God, I think. It has nothing to do with what Trump's doing or what the trans ideology is doing or what they're doing in Olympics. Those are all distractions. Those are our way to get ourselves out of taking responsibility for ourselves and the type of slavery that we're in. How do you measure worth? How do you measure worth? Read a little thing that Adam Sandler is worth $450 million, 440. He is worth that because he can make us laugh. And the more he can make us laugh, the more money he makes. And of course, it has to get, whatever, Adam Sandler. How do you define, what is the portrait of the best of humanity? When you see this social life and this organized group, and you're like, that's the best of humanity. What does it look like? According to the Olympic Committee, if you watch the closing ceremony, and the guy that was speaking, he was very clear on it. Those that were participating in the Olympic Games in some form or another are the best of humanity. That was the high ideal. If you know the personal stories of these athletes and these individuals and the coaches and everything else that goes on behind the scenes, I'm like, that's the best we got? But if that's all we have, then we somehow need to enter into that. If that's the best we have, and so the rest of us can't make the Olympics, and so how do we participate in the best that we have? You enter into their story by watching, by cheering on, by celebrating, by just entering into it and experiencing a little taste of that. And when your guy wins, you win. Right? I like the Olympics, actually, and I think there's something there, but it's not the high ideal. That's the problem. It's not that those things are bad in of itself. It's where we place it in the hierarchy of good. Right? That's the best that we have. When you see convocation services or graduations, the best and the brightest are those with the highest grades. And if you don't have the high grade, you're a little bit less. And on the 100-meter dash, what's the difference between first place and second place, Pete? It's like I don't know, 0.01 second sometimes. What is it? What's that translate to in dollar figure? Millions of dollars. You think about this, and to say that we're not caught up in that? They're living by a different story, the story of Egypt. And I think our culture is wound up in that Egyptian narrative. We think we need to be the thing that someone tells us that we need to be. We need to be skinny enough, muscular enough, have enough stuff, look good enough, have the right degree. Be where the action is. That's Egypt. So the first kind that enter rest here are those well-to-do who are sick of the way things are, who are tired of, who've come to the realization that, what is this? Come and enter into the rest of Jesus. The second kind, and I can't get into that, are those of religious weariness. That's chapter 12. It has two stories, and both have to do with putting food on the table. What is true religion? What is the Sabbath all about? What is the Sabbath thing? The Pharisees had a rules-based idea of the Sabbath. The more rules you can keep about the Sabbath, the more righteous you are. And so you're always measuring each other on the spiritual hierarchy. And the Pharisees thought they were quite righteous, and you can count righteous. Righteous was something you could count by how many times you went to Bible study, by how many times you went to hear, by how clean you look, by how you do this. It's all outward, it's all external, it's rules, rules, rules. Same as Egypt. It's just a religious side of it. And so Jesus is going through the grain field, and he's picking the grains, and I don't know if he just took them right off and eat them. Ed, do you do that? Could you satiate your... I don't know, I thought maybe they'd walk through the town and maybe go through the market and just pick up apples and stuff, something good. Anyway, he was making a point. I know what he's doing. And so his disciples were hungry. And so they went through this portion of the field that the Old Testament tells. So they were doing partly good. They left the corners of the field unharvested for travelers who would come through. Hospitality. But they were doing it on a Sunday, on a Sabbath. And the Pharisees let them have it. You guys are working. What is work? Right? What is work for? What is work? And Jesus tells them, Sabbath is made for man, man not for Sabbath. You are not a slave to the Sabbath. You're not rules to be kept. It's not rules to be kept. It's a way to live, to see the highest good for what it is and live according to the highest good and work towards that. That's Sabbath. Picking grain to satisfy hunger is, in a legal term, violation of the legal definition of the Sabbath. They got it wrong. Moses got it right. The Pharisees got it wrong. Jesus overthrows their religion of oppression by framing a religion of freedom. Not to do whatever you want, because to do whatever you want usually ends up in some kind of slavery again. So there is a yoke to be taken on, but it's something about freedom. And he points out from their own scripture how even David was doing it. And I like this one phrase. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath, even the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? They violate the Sabbath, but they're not guilty. And I was asking last week, and I'm not trying to justify me coming preaching or my guys are working on Sunday. But what is it, how somehow legally I'm profaning the Sabbath, but is there a way that I'm not guilty when I'm working on Sunday, when Alexis is selling Timbits to hungry churchgoers on Sunday morning who keep the Sabbath, but need Alexis to feed donuts to them? Somehow we're so just self-justifying in the way we see the Sabbath. It's because we don't get the Sabbath. Profane the Sabbath, but not guilty. It's a paradox. And then he does a healing on the Sabbath. And according to the Pharisee, the one that would rescue their own domestic animal for self-serving reasons on a Sabbath is okay. Right? He's preserving his economy. That's okay. And Jesus points that out to them. It is not considered work. Jesus proceeds to heal the man's withered hand. And the phrase used here to describe the healing is restored. Healthy like the other. So there's something healthy. There's a reference point to healthiness. And when we have healthy hands, you can work. And you can get into the rhythm of society in a good way. There's something good there. Both are a sign that the kingdom of heaven is near, and they're both portraits of perfecting. There's a move toward the perfection of all things. When you're healed, when your hand is healed, when your hunger is satisfied. It's a moving of perfecting. What is work? What is this yoke of rest we are to put on? From a practical level, we need to separate ourselves from the urgency of the current news cycle. We need to somehow get ourselves off, I call it unsocial media, because it is. And we can't let this thing go, and we want to know and pass this on. Did you hear how for what? We can't control those things. And we have this industry that makes a lot of money on making sure that we are outraged. It's the moral outrage industry. Yeah, right? Exactly. And we think we're doing good things by participating in our moral outrage of someone doing something bad. And then we've done our good deed. Separate ourselves from the urgency of the current news cycle. I think the other thing we need to do is we need to become sales resistant. One of the best books I ever read on work, Dimitri, and the relation to the Sabbath, and what creation is for, is by Wendell Berry. He's an American author, poet, conservationist. You can't pin him as a liberal. You can't pin him as a conservative. He won't be bought to either side. He's just speaking very matter of fact. He's not writing exclusively Christian, but it's Christian. And one of his main books, Sex, Freedom, Economy, and Community. And so that title alone should get you. Sex, Freedom, Community, and Economy. And he connects those three, and he writes little essays. I like it because it's little essays. I can keep my attention span. I gotta close off here soon, I know that. Anyway, his whole thing is about becoming sales resistant, learning to want less. That is a thing we have to learn, because right now, the salespeople are teaching us and are convincing us to buy something we already have. We think we are such reasonable consumers. We need to buy something that we already have. I need a new phone, just because it's there. And salesmen tap into this slavery mentality that we have. We have to have it. And we buy it just because. It's the best plan. It's the best phone plan. There's ways around it. It takes a little work. You don't need a new phone every 2 years. Selling us things we already own. That's two ways. And both of them are related to entering into into kairos time, quality time, celebration time, of good creation, of receiving who you are more and more. And you can only do that sitting with God. We have to do more of it. We're going to have to do more of it. I invite you to stand up to receive the blessing, and then I will dismiss you. There's no last song. I will not be singing you a last song. You won't want that. The blessing is the blessing that Moses had Aaron give to his people. It's a very good one from Numbers 6. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and daughters, saying, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Let the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you rest." You're dismissed.